and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you guys so much for joining us. A little bit of show business. It is Friday. We are not going to be here Monday. It is Labor Day. So there'll be no show Labor Day. We'll be barbecuing, doing what you do on Labor Day. And then we will be back with a great show on Tuesday, just after Labor Day, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. So be sure to join us then. And I hope you guys have a really great weekend. All right. Today on the show, we have a great one for you. You might have heard about the idea out there that has floated around that neocons are actually Marxist Trotskyites, that Trotskyites were the group that were opposed to Stalin. You had the Stalin Marxists and you had the Trotskyites. I cannot say it properly, but the Trotskyite Marxists. And those two Marxist groups, they basically clashed with one another, and the Trotskyites moved away, ran off into the West, and essentially became modern neocons. And that actually our neocon infrastructure, the neocon thinkers here in this country are actually Trotskyites and Marxists. You might have heard this from Alex Jones has mentioned this a few times, and there have been others, and this has floated around. Today, we're going to have an expert explain and break this down for us. Caleb Maupin joins us on the show. He just recently wrote and released a new book, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, The Whole Story. So we are going to get that whole story, at least part of it. I mean, we're not going to cover the entire book in this hour, but certainly we're going to get some chunks, and we're going to understand what is the reality of the Trotskyites and the neoconservatives. Are the neoconservatives actually Marxists in disguise that have infiltrated our country and taken over? We're going to get the real story. That is coming up here with Caleb Maupin here on the Kim Iversen Show. Caleb Maupin, welcome back to the show. It's always great to have you.
Sure. Glad to be here.
It's always great to get the history lesson. And we're about to have one today. Okay, so Alex Jones, I've heard him talk about this, say the Trotskyites, they're the ones who actually are the neocons. Stalin should have done away with them from the very beginning, and then we wouldn't have all the problems that we have. So this is the extent of what I know when it comes to Trotskyites and the neoconservatives, is just kind of the rumblings that I've heard, very low little rumblings online. Kind of a fringe topic, I'm not going to lie, but an important one, because you do have the Alex Joneses in the world saying the neocons are Marxists, essentially, right? Like Marxists, the basic premise being Marxists have infiltrated our system, and we're all in danger of these Marxists. It's these Trotskyist Marxists, and we've got to, alert. That's kind of been my impression of this. Am I summing that up correctly?
Sure. Ever since the Bush years, there's been conversation about the fact that all these war hawks in Washington, D.C., many of whom are around the Republican Party, but they have influence among the Democrats as well, that they originated as followers of Leon Trotsky. And to this day, no one has ever actually just written a book about this relationship. There's a lot of books that touch on it that I quote: Alan M. Wald's book, The New York Intellectuals, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon. There's a lot written about this trajectory. However, I am the one who decided I just had to compile it all into one because there's conversation about it. And this book takes you through the history, starting with Leon Trotsky, his life and death, his exile from the USSR, his building a movement of intellectual Marxists around the world who opposed the Soviet Union, to the 1939 split among his followers in the lead up to World War II. Where the New York intellectuals cut their ties with Trotsky over some big disagreements, to when Max Shachtman started working for the CIA during the McCarthy period, 1949, all the way up until a number of them started supporting Richard Nixon in 1972 or earlier because they considered the Democrats to be too soft on communism. There is a trajectory that leads us all the way up to John Bolton, who just had his home raided. John Bolton comes out of people who studied Sovietology in the 1970s and 80s, an academic field of studying Russia, opposing Russia, seeing, Stalinist communism as the main enemy. And they were crafted as a field by the neocons, the former Trotskyites, who kind of gave them an intellectual framework with which to oppose Russia and become hard right Cold Warriors. So that history is important to go over. And there is an intellectual continuity to it. There is a strand of thinking they held on to. These people went from being the far, far left to being, the conservative right-wing war hawks. But there is a certain continuity of thought that you can trace. And that's what my book focuses on.
Okay. And I guess what I'm trying to wrap up for everybody watching is why this matters. And because, otherwise it's like, okay, history, neat, there's a lot of history out there. And this seems to be like a very pinpointed point in history. And I think the reason why this is relevant is because for two reasons, really. The first being, you do have, like I mentioned, the Alex Joneses of the world saying Marxists, well, we're hearing this a lot in the conservative circles, right? Marxism, and it is infiltrated. And here's an example of it. It's Trotskyites who are actually the neocons, and they've already infiltrated us, and we're screwed. That's kind of been Alex Jones's and those, and even Jackson Hinkle was on his show recently saying this, basically having the same discussion, that it was the Trotskyites that are these Marxists have infiltrated. And yeah, they claim that they're spreading capitalism and democracy, but ultimately they're these Marxists that have infiltrated our system, and we should be on a high alert. The second, so that's what we want to break down today is it true that Marxists have already infiltrated, our system, and that's who's actually running it? Now, of course, you're coming from a different angle on that. I think, do you consider yourself a Marxist?
I come out of the Marxist tradition. I mean,
Okay.
I believe in God. I don't really believe in dialectical materialism, the philosophical underpinnings, but I'm certainly an admirer of many of the governments that have based themselves on Marxism around the world. I oppose imperialism and the Western domination of the world by big monopolies. Why is it relevant, though? I'll tell you why it's relevant. Because the American people overwhelmingly reject regime change wars. Left, right, center, polls show Americans do not want us to be involved in conflicts around the world. Yet in our government, the deep state, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies are staffed full of people who've been trained to believe that the United States is on a mission to spread democracy around the world, to overthrow various governments, that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are equivalent and the same, and it is the mission of the United States to destabilize and overthrow similar governments and spread freedom in this big crusade around the world. That's called neoconservatism. That is a school of thought that became dominant in academia and in foreign policy studies in the Ivy League. And that school of thought was invented by former Trotskyists, people who broke with Trotsky, who'd been followers of Trotsky, they'd been communists, and they eventually crafted together this worldview the American people reject, but it's very prevalent within our deep state.
Okay. Right. And we'll get to exactly that issue as well. A second issue that I identify as being why this topic particularly matters right now is the big discussion we see a lot on X, which is Jews control the world, right? I mean, it's kind of this, it's the Jews. They're the ones who have caused all these problems, right? There was, and we hear this like even when it comes to people say, well, it's the Jews that created Marxism, the Jews that were spreading it, the Jews that caused that. And it's like they're the ones who are really behind all of that. And the Trotskyists were actually mostly Jewish, right? So there's this Jewish intellectual group. And then those same Jewish intellectuals with the direct lineage basically became the neocons, American neocons, who are in the same Jewish intellectual circles. So when we hear, so I at some point want to get into that as well, how much of this is like a Jewish conspiracy, versus a Jewish conspiracy theory, right? Is it a conspiracy or is it a conspiracy theory? And I want to break into that as well, because a lot of people are talking about, it's the Jews that are doing all of this, right? And I know you touch on that in your book as well, right? And you don't think that it is, just to clarify from the beginning, right? You don't believe that it's a Jewish conspiracy, that's more of a conspiracy theory. Am I right on that?
Yes, there's an element there that needs to be acknowledged, which is that, Trotsky, his difference with Lenin and Stalin was that for him, his embracement of Marxism and the revolutionary movement was an expression of his alienation from Russian society. For him, he was Jewish. He experienced a huge amount of discrimination. He grew up in what is, in Kherson, which is a territory that's now disputed in the special military operation. His family experienced discrimination, and he spent his life in Western Europe. And for him, being of Jewish descent and embracing Marxist politics was a way of kind of opposing the society he came from. And he developed this theory called the permanent revolution. And the idea was that in a country that was impoverished and not yet industrialized like Russia, the working class, the revolutionary working class could take power, but their focus should be spreading communism to where it counts, which is the Western world. Trotsky loved the West. He lived in New York City at the time of the Russian Revolution. He actually developed a reputation for refusing to tip in restaurants, which I find to be a little bit hilarious. He got soup spilled on him in restaurants. He was kicked out of various restaurants in New York City for refusing to tip. He would give the waiter a condescending speech about you should form a union. You shouldn't, depend on guys like me for a tip. And for Trotsky, being a Bolshevik, being a Marxist was an expression of alienation. For Lenin and Stalin, it was very much opposition to the Western system, right? Lenin developed this whole theory of capitalism had entered the stage of imperialism, and that nations struggling for national liberation would break out of imperialism and use a socialist planned economy to build themselves up. Trotsky is saying, well, no, it's the Western countries are the most advanced, and eventually the Western working class will seize power, and the most advanced West will create the most advanced socialism. And that you can read what Lenin wrote about the Jewish Bund, which is a group of Marxists in Russia that aligned with Trotsky, right? Lenin forms the Bolshevik Party. Trotsky doesn't join it, and he groups with some other people, and they're called the August Bloc, and among them is a group called the Jewish Bund. And the Jewish Bund basically says that we Jews, we're so special, we're so different, we can't join a regular communist party. We have to have our own group for Jews only. And Lenin writes about this, Lenin himself also of Jewish descent, and he calls this the spirit of the ghetto, right? This idea that we are so different, we are so special, we have to be separate. And he says Zionism is the ultimate expression of the spirit of the ghetto, the idea that Jews need their own state, they can never fit in Europe or whatever. But he argues that the Jewish Bund is also an expression of that. And it's this anti-populism, the idea that the masses of people, the bulk of the population, especially for Trotsky, the peasantry, they are dangerous, they're backward, they need to be controlled. That's a big part of Trotsky's mindset. And that is a big part of neoconservatism. It's also a big part of Zionism. So you can see that kind of that intellectual continuity, that kind of superiority and persecution complex that kind of defines Zionist thought. Trotsky had that. The neocons certainly have that. That's where you can see things. It's a mindset. It's not a conspiracy.
Right.
And I would say that probably the father of this kind of thinking is Friedrich Nietzsche, who was not Jewish at all, right? And philosophical irrationalism, what he wrote about the Übermensch and, the last man and the blonde beast and all of that, that's really the basis for all of this. And Friedrich Nietzsche is widely considered to be anti-Semitic. And a lot of the neocons are not Jewish. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was an advisor to Hillary Clinton, is largely, responsible for the U.S. military intervention in Libya. She's very much a neocon. She's an Irish American. Mary McCarthy was from this school. She was very, very big among these circles. Dwight McDonald. So, they're not all Jewish necessarily, but if you want to look for a continuity, it is that persecution superiority complex that kind of defines Zionism, that defined the Jewish Bund, that you can see a lot in Trotsky's alienation from Russian society.
Is there really when you say that there's a supremacy sort of element to that? Because I see a lot of these same sorts of feelings and even discussions in the Black community, for example, more recently, and in the more recent years, where the discussions have gone to, it's the white, like racism, like privilege, white privilege, which telling people you're privileged because you're white, and so therefore you have to acknowledge that you have this problem and understand that you're causing racism even when you're not trying to, right? It's kind of, even though they call it white privilege, it's actually that the other group is putting another group down, putting whites down, almost saying, you have this, you're born with this problem, this like fundamental problem, this disease almost. And so I see this even in a mentality within the Black community here in the United States, which is we've been oppressed for so long. We want to be separated from you, right? There was many years, especially when I was growing up in the 90s, there's many years where it was like, we're all the same. Let's all come together, be together. And then what we've seen in the last 10 years, I don't even know how long it's been, but certainly it was very prominent when Trump first took office, right? That's when I think a lot of this discussion really was out there. And it was this, we need to be separated actually from you. And it's cultural appropriation if you try to do things that our group has always done, and vice versa. And so I see some of those same elements there, but I don't know if I would classify Blacks as having if it comes out of a feeling of superiority. So that's why I'm questioning was it a function with this group and Zionists, maybe with Zionists more so, maybe, but maybe not even, the idea of, but we are superior. Now, people will say yes, because of the chosen one mentality that is within Judaism, that is not within the vast majority of other religions or even thinking. And so people might pin it on that specifically, and sometimes I do as well. And often, in fact, I think that's a major issue. But do you think that, is it really truly out of supremacism? Or do you think it's more out of this victimhood, kind of like what I'm illustrating with the Black community, where it kind of creates this division naturally, like, well, you're never going to accept us, you're never going to like us, so we might as well just be separated from you?
It's complex. It's a specific situation. You can't really compare it to any others. Right before he dies, Trotsky writes a biography of Stalin called Stalin, an Appraisal, right? Writing about Stalin. And the first 5 or 6 pages of the book are all about how Stalin is, quote, Asiatic, meaning that he's like people in the East and he's not, sophisticated and Western. And he compares Stalin to Genghis Khan, and he talks about, this concept. It's a racist trope in Western media about Asiatic despotism, right? This idea that people in Asia are just inherently authoritarian and brutal. And Trotsky plays that up and baits Stalin over the fact that he's born in Georgia, that he's from the Russian Empire, and that, he went to seminary school, got his training in a Christian seminary school, and that Trotsky sees Stalin as the incarnation of the peasant masses of Russia, this inferior blob of scary people. And, you really have to go back to the 1930s in the United States when, Roosevelt was the president, and Roosevelt embraced the Soviet Union as an ally against fascism. He recognized the Soviet Union diplomatically. And the Communist Party of the United States went into kind of a patriotic overdrive. They had these big Madison Square Garden rallies. They said communism is nothing but 20th century Americanism. They waved the American flag and they said racism is fascist, racism is un-American, labor unions are good. It was kind of this kind of patriotic, socialistic, anti-racism. That was the message of the Communist Party. The Trotskyites were the wing of communism that was considered to be more radical than that. The Communist Party was kind of toning it down in their alliance with Roosevelt. The Trotskyites were the ones that were still screaming about workers' revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat. And among kind of wealthy intellectuals and others, to be a Trotskyist was this very edgy, radical thing to do, right? If, communism was already quite popular. They controlled 2 city council seats in New York City. The member of the House of Representatives in Harlem was a guy named Vito Marcantonio, who was very close to the Communist Party. And so communism is already very trendy in the city in the Roosevelt years. But to be a Trotskyist meant that you were this radical, edgy interpretation of communism. Mm-hmm. But all of that changes in 1939 when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany sign a non-aggression pact. And all of a sudden, the mainstream media and the Roosevelt administration, all of them go into an anti-communist overdrive. The communists are hypocrites. They've been saying that fascism is the enemy. They've been building an anti-fascist front, but yet they sign a pact with Hitler. And the media just goes into this anti-communist overdrive. Roosevelt imprisons Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party. So all these intellectuals in New York City, all of a sudden, they can't be associated with Trotsky anymore. They can't be Marxists. And their main disagreement is that Trotsky says the Soviet Union is led by a Stalinist bureaucracy, but it's technically socialist in its foundation. They can't be associated with that. Oh, no. They come out with this theory that the Soviet Union is what they call bureaucrat collectivism, and it's the same economic system. It's neither capitalist or socialist. It's the same as Nazi Germany, and it's a danger, and they want to be not associated with it anymore. And it's mainstream media has gone into an anti-communist, anti-Soviet overdrive. They're afraid of their careers. They're afraid of their reputation. And so what was at one point a very trendy thing to be is suddenly not popular anymore. And so they're running away from it. And they write all kinds of screeds about they want to think for themselves. And they attack the Trotskyist movement for having cult of the leader. And for not allowing free thought and not allowing intellectuals. They say, well, we're not going to take orders from Moscow, from Stalin, or from Mexico City, where Trotsky's living. We think for ourselves. And, they think for themselves. That's why they go along with mainstream media, right? I mean, and we see this up to today. I mean, for years we've heard that. People, in the name of intellectual freedom, in the name of not following propaganda, you follow the CNN line. Yeah. And it's it's a middle class trend of basically they couldn't put themselves at odds with the prevailing foreign policy institutions of the United States. And that when the Trotskyist movement was pivoting in a way that would put them at odds with the American government and the prevailing mainstream, they couldn't go along with it. They couldn't stomach it. It's an expression of intellectual cowardice more than anything.
Before we go any further, I think I want to get to the point of why you wrote this book.
Okay.
And so are you arguing like against Alex Jones's idea that the Trotskyites that the neocons are actually Trotskyites, that the Marxists have already taken over? Because I would think if the Marxists have taken over, you might like that because you come from more of a Marxist way of thinking, right? So you might be like, yeah, the Marxists have taken over. That's great. No problem. But you're arguing, no, that's not what this is. So tell us, what exactly is it? Are you saying the Trotskyites are Marxists and yes, they've taken over and they are the new neocons? Or are you saying they're not?
I'm saying that Leon Trotsky was a deviant. He interpreted Marxism in a deviant way that put him at odds with the Soviet government. And his deviant interpretation of Marxism laid the foundation for a school of people that eventually evolved into people that are crafting U.S. foreign policy. And that you can find the roots of, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay. So then I think what we have to get to the root of is, what was Stalin and his thinking about Marxism and those who followed Stalin versus Trotsky and the people who followed Trotsky? Because if they're both considered Marxism to, anybody but people within your world who are very knowledgeable about Marxism can parse it all out. The average person just thinks blanket Marxism, right? So what is the difference? Because there is a possibility that people, and I see this all the time with people who are passionate activists, I would say, is that they adopt a cause and they'll run with this cause, but they're not really fully aware of what the cause is. They're just passionate people who they just see something's wrong. And so they kind of go, okay, this must be it. So we've got to fight this thing. And they kind of go along with that. And then as they open their eyes a bit, and learn more, then they start to say, well, okay, maybe that's not actually the thing, it's this other thing. But they're still focused on the core problem. It might just not have the same solution to them anymore. So I'm kind of wondering, because Marxism is a type of, it's an ideology, a way of thinking, and, is it the case that there were two groups? One group, the Stalin, Lenin-style Marxists, actually believed here's a economic problem that is truly economic at its core. And if we just solve the economic function, then we would solve the problem. Versus the other group who might have been like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, let's there is this big problem. But really at the root of their problem was there's outsiders and insiders. Do you see what I'm saying? Because if your idea is more there's outsiders and insiders, and that's the problem you're trying to correct. And at first you might say, then it's economic, so yeah, I'm going to go with these Marxists. But then you might evolve away from that and say it's still outsiders, insiders, but it's the authoritarian, it's the fascists, it's the dictators. Because I could make an argument that the Trotskyites are in fact neocons, but maybe they just changed the name of how they label themselves. Now you might say there's no way that the neocons are Trotskyites because the neocons are capitalists, right? And they're going around the world spreading democracy and capitalism. And Trotskyites wanted to go around the world spreading Marxism. That was kind of their fundamental, Stalin wanted to keep Marxism in Russia, in the USSR, and Trotskyites felt like, no, this needs to be a worldwide kind of spreading struggle. And the neocons definitely do that, right? I mean, they go around and they're like, we're spreading democracy. Here we are, like doing another regime change. And all they do is they talk about how much they hate dictators. That sounds a lot like the Trotskyites saying, we hate this authoritarian Stalin and the authoritarianism of Russia or of the USSR or whatever. And you've also got the Trotskyites saying, it's our obligation to spread this. The neocons also started a lot of these, USAID programs, right? So it's kind of like Marxism. You're like, we're giving a bunch of money. We're going to give you money. We're going to give you money. But now but it's under you've got to live the way we think you should live with our ideology. The wanting to spread war everywhere, Trotskyites, that neocons, that one's definitely parallel. But it also seems like I mean, what? We've been battling Russia, and that's been a head scratcher for many of us. Like, why? Why Russia forever? Like, why? Where did this deep-rooted hatred for Russia comes from? Well, the Trotskyites. I mean, that makes sense.
Well, when it really gets down to it, I mean, we have to understand this system that we live under, that now among Trump circles, people call it globalism. But it really emerged in around the time of 1900. Capitalism in the Western countries went from just being factory owners and factory workers to being big banks and big monopolies that stretched their tentacles all across the planet. And that was a big game changer, right? Marx had always talked about the workers versus the bosses. But Lenin comes along and he says, well, it's actually not the workers versus the bosses. It's these big bankers, these big imperialist monopolies that are dominating the world and keeping the world poor in order to keep themselves rich. And the struggle is not the workers versus the bosses. It's rather the nations of the world struggling to break out of that system. That's what Lenin bases his entire movement on. And Lenin was a deviant Marxist. Bolshevism was like a weird spin-off of Marxism. And the Western Marxists looked at Bolshevism. They said, this is almost like a monastic religious order or a cult or something like that. This isn't real Marxism. This is a strange thing. Lenin has his whole party of new type, which is this very disciplined organization for only those who give the whole of their lives. He says nationalism can be good if you're fighting to break a country out of Western domination. He has this whole new interpretation of things. Trotsky doesn't really buy it. And for Trotsky, Marxism is a way to be Western. And it still does believe that the West is the best and the West is the center of the world. And that Marxism is just kind of continuing the ideals of Western civilization, taking them to their further conclusion, really creating an egalitarian society, on the basis of the French Revolution and that kind of thing. Whereas for Lenin and especially for Stalin, Marxism is a vehicle. It becomes a movement that is a basis for non-Western countries to establish their own identity, break out of the Western system, and begin to go their own way and build themselves up. That is the fundamental difference in interpretations. And Trotsky, he repudiated his theories of permanent revolution. He said, I apologize. He joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917, but he still held on to that worldview. And ultimately, he disagreed with Stalin on the question of China. He disagreed with Stalin on a number of points. He ended up getting kicked out of the Soviet Union. He moved to Turkey. He moved to France. He moved to Mexico City. And in the final years of his life, he was basically aligning himself with fascists and with Nazi Germany because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And one big thing the Nazis were playing up is they wanted to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. They were, promoting Ukrainian nationalism. Well, Trotsky organized his followers to have a movement for an independent socialist Ukraine and to call for Ukraine to break away from the Soviet Union. In Spain, you had the Spanish Republic that had a lot of communists in the government, facing a fascist Franco trying to overthrow it. Well, the Soviet Union is organizing volunteers from all over the world to go fight for the Spanish Republic. And so Trotsky and his followers in Spain launch an armed uprising against the Spanish Republic, saying that it's holding back the working class, etc. And that, at the final year of his life, 1939, the Republicans in the United States, Martin Dies forms the Dies Committee, which eventually becomes the House Un-American Activities Committee, investigating Roosevelt for his ties to the Communist Party. Trotsky is invited to testify before the Dies Committee, and he agrees to do it. And the Republicans are going to fly Trotsky into the United States to give a speech to Congress against the Communist Party and against President Roosevelt. Now, ultimately, it was a bit of a scandal. Obviously, Trotsky's a Marxist. They're Republicans, so they rescinded the invitation. But Trotsky was somebody who had been part of the Russian Revolution, but had a falling out with the leaders of the Soviet Union. He fled to the West, and he functioned as a professional anti-communist for a decade or so, before ultimately being assassinated by an agent of Stalin, right? Because Stalin saw him demobilizing the war effort. Trotsky was against World War II, and he was having his followers go and try to organize a union to disrupt the U.S. military. When France was invaded by the Nazis, he condemned the Communist Party for building kind of a patriotic resistance to the Nazis. He was prepared to, play a disruptive role in World War II, and Stalin thought that was too much of a threat, that everything had to be done to defeat the Nazis. So he was ultimately killed. He was found guilty in absentia in the Soviet Union for allegedly conspiring with other Soviet leaders to overthrow Stalin. I can't confirm that that's necessarily true, but it appears to some degree or other fascists were boosting Trotsky. William Randolph Hearst, the anti-Roosevelt, somewhat fascistic conservative in America was republishing Trotsky's writings. The Italian government of Mussolini was distributing Trotsky's writings. Trotsky became the spin-off interpretation of Marxism that was useful to the Soviet Union's enemies. Very similar to Gregor Strasser, right? There was a Nazi who had been a founding member of the Nazi Party along with Hitler, a guy named Gregor Strasser, who had a falling out with Hitler, and Hitler killed him. And so his brother, Otto Strasser, fled to Britain and had a radio program broadcast into Germany from Britain saying, well, I'm a true Nazi and Hitler's a big sellout. I'm the true National Socialist. And that this kind of thing happens. This is how intelligence and geopolitical games are played. Trotsky switched sides when it came to the Soviet Union. He was working against the Soviet Union. He developed a following of intellectuals who wanted to be with him so they could be ultra radical. They didn't like the Popular Front. They didn't like aligning with Roosevelt and the kind of vague anti-fascism that the Communist Party emphasized in the late 30s. But eventually those folks, in their alienation from American society and their alienation from Roosevelt, and then ultimately their refusal to really go at odds with U.S. foreign policy, ended up forming their own kind of separate movement. And the leader of that movement was a guy named Max Shachtman. And it's so weird because Max Shachtman, he's kind of unknown outside of Marxist circles. But think about post-war American politics. Jeane Kirkpatrick, she was the UN ambassador of Ronald Reagan. She was once a follower of Max Shachtman. Carl Gershman, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, he was once a follower of Max Shachtman. George Meany, who headed the AFL-CIO in the 50s and 60s, Max Shachtman was his personal secretary, his top advisor. And Max Shachtman is this deviant Trotskyite, this Trotskyite who broke with Trotsky. You can play, 6 degrees of separation. He is connected to the entire political apparatus, the New Left, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Mary McCarthy. All these people, they trace back to Max Shachtman. He was kind of the intellectual father of all of this. Bayard Rustin, who was, Martin Luther King Jr.'s key strategist, also trained and a follower of Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman, who became useful to American intelligence starting in the late 1940s, he ends up becoming this very, very influential figure who is guiding all kinds of forces that end up being the leaders of the political left, the founders of DSA, Michael Harrington, Irving Howe, they're followers of Max Shachtman, and the Neoconservatives, Irving Kristol, the father of Bill Kristol. It's kind of amazing to see how connected Max Shachtman is to the American establishment.
To both sides.
Both sides, yes, right, because they both share this kind of celebration of the West and American individualism and the opposition, right? And that DSA is people in the Socialist Party who eventually formed the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and Social Democrats USA is the wing of the followers of Max Shachtman who were supporting Republicans, who were supporting Richard Nixon. And it's fascinating to see that the left and the right, they all can get traced back to this obscure Marxist guy who was kind of their guru, who was teaching them, and he was gradually becoming more and more pro-U.S. He supported the Vietnam War, he supported the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he ultimately endorsed Richard Nixon in the final year of his life. He first supported more moderate Democrats, Henry Jackson and Hubert Humphrey, but when George McGovern won the 1972 Democratic primary, he thought George McGovern was too soft on communism, and that George McGovern wanted to immediately end the Vietnam War. No, we got to fight the Stalinists. So he endorsed Richard Nixon in the final years of his life. He dies shortly afterwards. However, his followers go on to kind of establish what's now considered neoconservatism. Irving Kristol, the father of Bill Kristol, his New York Times obituary, you talk about that elitism. It tells the story of how he stopped being a leftist. And he says it was he got drafted into the army. And when he was in the army, he says he had written about the working class before. It was the first time he actually met them, and he didn't like them. And he considered them to be, dangerous. They're a bunch of toughs. They're anti-Semitic. He says, I can't build socialism with these people. They'll just try to make a racket out of it. And that he's an intellectual for a reason. He's better than these Midwestern street toughs, he calls them, that are in the military with them. It's contempt for the people. That is really what flows through it. And Leo Strauss, who was never a Trotskyist, he's a philosophy professor who fled Nazi Germany, and he becomes kind of also the guru to these folks. And his whole thesis is that the philosophers of history have all had to write in code, because the masses of people will persecute them if they find out what they really think. And that we have to create a society where the philosopher kings, in the Platonic sense, the superior intellectuals, won't be messed with by the vulgar mob, the masses of people who would seek to suppress them. That's the narrative, and that they equate Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and they see them both as expressions of excessive democracy. When ordinary people, stupid ordinary rabble who aren't smart and intellectual, when we get involved in politics, we set up authoritarian regimes that threaten freedom. And so everything needs to be done to control the masses of people. And the noble lie, the idea that it's okay to lie to those masses of people because they just can't understand politics, right? They just can't understand it. So it's okay to manipulate and lie to them. Leo Strauss, his favorite TV show is Gunsmoke, the cowboy TV show where the good guy wears a white hat and is all good. The bad guy wears a black hat and is all bad. He says that's how average Americans should come to understand politics. And interestingly, as neoconservatism cements itself in Republican circles, we have two presidents who take on a cowboy persona. Ronald Reagan is literally a cowboy actor from Hollywood. George W. Bush is born in Connecticut, but yet he's putting on his cowboy hat and he's out on his ranch with his dog Barney and all of that. And that this had a lot to do with the neocons and how they crafted strategic messaging and winning the American people to support the wars. And their mission is to carry out a crusade to spread freedom around the world because these regimes out there, they threaten the precious freedom of the intellectuals. They see, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, all the various governments the USA has overthrown. They're an example of the rabble getting together and threatening their freedom.
Okay, so then it sounds to me, and maybe I'm wrong on this, maybe I'm not hearing you right, but it sounds to me like Alex Jones is right and that the Trotskyists have taken over and they control everything. I mean, the left and the right, and they've just wreaked havoc. I mean, if it all boils down to these few people and that they're the ones who are actually like the father thinkers of the left and the right, and the left, and we all see what happens every single time there's a State of the Union, right? The left and the right both give standing ovations to war. Anytime there's war, we all cheer for it. Both sides, doesn't matter, right? And both sides love to spread democracy and depose dictators. That is what they have in common completely. And that sounds a lot like these intellectuals that you're talking about who are kind of the fathers of this sort of way of thinking. I mean, that sounds like it's true then. The Trotskyites have won. They've taken over and they've infiltrated and we're now, what do we do now?
Well, Trotsky still considered himself a Marxist, and Trotsky was not willing to completely throw the Soviet Union out. He maintained it was a deformed workers' state. This is a group of people that were followers of Trotsky, broke with him at the beginning of World War II, and carried with them a certain level of intellectual alienation and anti-populism that had defined their politics. That's why they'd become Marxists to begin with. They wanted to be edgy. They were different than everybody else and all of that. And they carry that kind of strand of thinking with them as they craft U.S. foreign policy. And John Bolton, who is, somebody that is just widely hated among the American people. He's a war hawk. Trump kicked him out of his administration. They've just had his home raided. He's somebody who was trained in the Sovietology academia fields that are very much crafted by these people. And that this mindset kind of defines U.S. foreign policy. And the American people don't agree. We don't agree.
Right. The American people don't agree.
They know that. They don't like us. They think it's okay to lie to us and manipulate us to support their wars.
Yeah. But I'm not willing to just yet throw out the fact that that they're not Marxists. And let me explain. Because I don't think that the U.S. foreign policy with wars, their bloodlust and endless desires to depose dictators, I don't know if that really has anything to do with capitalism. Now, I think there's definitely a strain of those who support the wars, who say, yeah, this will be great for us too. So we'll support your war. It is kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? We'll go to a group, we'll say, okay, we'll support your revolution. We don't really agree with you, but we'll support it because the end goal, we have the same end goal. So I don't know if the neocons are actually capitalists. I think there's definitely capitalists within the same who have the same agenda. So they say, okay, we'll fund the wars, we'll help you because ultimately then we want to have the resources, we want to build businesses, we want to do these things. But I don't think that's like why John Bolton goes into war, for example. I don't think John Bolton has a shred of capitalistic thinking or ideology in his brain. I think he just wants war with the Soviets for whatever reason. And that would be some almost like deep-seated, ingrained, taught from birth sort of hatred of the Soviets for no other reason other than just to hate them. And so that, when I think of like the neocons, like even the Hillary Clintons of the world or whoever, or with Bill Kristol, or even like Zionism, right? Like when you look at that, none of this is rooted in capitalism. There's not really an economic strain to this. There's something else there that causes them to be rabidly pro-war. So I don't know if I'm willing to totally throw away. Now I know, you know, and you know, you and I might disagree on Marxism or whatever, but I'm not. To me, it's just an economic thing. I don't actually look at capitalism or Marxism as inherently evil or not evil. I just look at them as economic structures there's no, like, they don't have feelings. So you can either make capitalism or Marxism, I think, evil, and you could also make probably both of them benevolent. I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter. They're just economic systems. So, and one might be more flawed than the other or whatever, and we could have that debate all day, but to me, that part doesn't actually really matter. So, you know, I'm not really willing to, and so I'm saying that so that you understand that when I say I'm not willing to say that they're not Marxists yet, it's not because I'm saying, oh, they're Marxists because they're evil. I'm just saying, okay, that's just an economic thing. So, and I don't think that their warmongering has anything to do with capitalism. I just don't. I don't think that there are groups who do that want to siphon resources and want to take advantage. I just don't think it's this neocon group. And I actually don't really know what their motivation is, except they hate authority, they hate dictators, they want to depose them, they want to spread democracy.
Well, putting aside what their motivations in their own head might be, I mean, I'm not a mind reader. I read what they write and what they say their motivations are. Let's just talk about the facts. Until Stalin came along, Russia was an underdeveloped agrarian country, wasn't fully electrified, wasn't industrialized. Stalin did the 5-year economic plans, and they built the largest power plant in the world. They built a huge oil industry, a huge steel industry. After the Second World War, they became the first country in outer space. They built themselves up into an industrial superpower. And suddenly they were no longer an impoverished section of the world that we could dump our resources on and sell products to. They were a competitor on the global stage. And the same for China. Until the Chinese Communist Party came along, China was a deeply poor country. Now China's the second largest economy in the world. Huawei Technologies makes way better phones than Apple, the biggest telecommunications giant in the world, the biggest steel industry in the world. They've lifted 800 million people from poverty. They've turned China into a powerhouse. And now, again, China's not a captive market that the Rockefellers can sell oil to, that we can dump products onto and, get addicted to opium and opium wars. Now China is a competitor. Right. And that's what monopolies don't want. Monopolies don't want competitors. And that imperialism is monopolistic capitalism, capitalism in its monopolistic stage. And so that's where these wars flow from, and that these monopolies, they fund big think tanks that hire academics to think about how to push their system and oppose their competitors. And if you're an academic and you want to get jobs and you want to get book deals and you want to get promoted, you say what those foundations want to hear. Right. And a group of Trotskyites seems to have realized that they could hold on to their edgy radical beliefs and their desire to tear it down and win the world for justice, but they could go to work for Western imperialism, tearing down the regimes that get in its way, rather than working, to oppose the Western system. I think that's really what it gets down to for me.
How do you explain, so just so that I understand the difference, because I don't, Germany, Nazi Germany, actually had, I think, in history, the fastest economic turnaround in the history of ever, right?
Sure.
So what was their economic system compared to, like, when you're bringing up Soviet Union or China? What was different about Nazi Germany, or was it the same?
It was very different. Germany was already industrialized. It was an industrial power at the time that Hitler came to power, and they were experiencing the Great Depression, and they were, devastated economically. And he used a heavy-handed authoritarian state to reboot their economy, primarily with militarism and degrowth. It's been said before, they put half the country in concentration camps and the other half in military uniforms. But they took a number of very dramatic moves that it was a dramatic method of reverse inflation. They forced women out of the workforce. They had a big campaign. They have a picture of a woman. This woman is taking a job away from a good German man who has kids to feed. They threw all the labor leaders in concentration camps. They hired a bunch of people to work in the concentration camps as guards, a bunch of people to build the concentration camps. A bunch of people are in the concentration camps, so they're no longer looking for jobs. They built the Autobahn highways connecting Germany across. They restarted military spending, which they hadn't had since the end of the First World War. And as a result of like boom, 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 very dramatic moves, imprisoning a bunch of people, drastically shifting the workforce, getting rid of unemployment, they were able to reboot the economy of Germany for 4 or 5 years. But by 1939, the German economy was slowing down again. And that's why they had to expand. And as they expanded, they seized these territories. They were acquiring more slave laborers. And they stimulated private corporations like Volkswagen by having a bunch of concentration camp inmates work for them for free. It was like the first prison industrial complex. And that it was basically, there's a good book by Lothrop Stoddard, who was a white supremacist, a Ku Klux Klan member, who was on the board of Planned Parenthood when it started. The Nazis liked him enough. They took him over to Nazi Germany as World War II was starting. He wrote a book about how their economic system works, which I've quoted in some of my other works. And basically, Lothrop Stoddard says they took it out of their own hides. They destroyed the productive forces of Germany. They kind of forcibly destroyed the productive forces of Germany. They made the population largely poorer, and in doing so, they eradicated unemployment, and they got the economy moving again for 4 or 5 years, and then it slowed down.
Yeah.
It was not a state-run economy. Krupp and Tyson and Hallemer Schacht, the banker who picked out Hitler and decided he would be the dictator as an alternative to communism, they were never nationalized. They never had their property taken away. They were making profits hand over foot, but they had a very heavy-handed government that made sure that there was no opposition to them and was kind of forcing these degrowth economic measures to stabilize the economy.
Mm-hmm. And so there's now another thing that kind of makes this a really relevant topic is that there's a lot of discussion right now circling on X about, well, we should have backed Hitler in the war. Have you seen these discussions that have been happening all over? The question, did we side with the wrong side? Should we have opposed Stalin instead and basically sided with Hitler? Pick your dictator, I suppose, is what people are kind of saying, and questioning whether or not the United States made and the West, whether or not they made the right decision, which I think tracks with this whole thing. I mean, again, if the Trotskyites were the ones that just hated the U.S., that they hated Stalin so much, and then they kind of converted into this, and they also had this idea of global domination in a way, like global spread. And then they go and they infiltrate American circles, or they become the elite in American intellectual circles, and they influence everybody. I mean, that is like here we are today. It didn't take very long, 75 years or something, right? Here we are today, and we've waged numerous wars around the world under the pretense of spreading democracy. And now here we are at 75 years having a discussion of, did we side with the wrong guy? So, I mean,
those discussions were widespread in the lead up to World War II. Harry Truman said on the floor of Congress that if it looks like Stalin is going to win, we should back Hitler. And if it looks like Hitler is going to win, we should back Stalin so we can weaken both countries and we can dominate the world. And the America First Committee, which was a group of a lot of very powerful people that didn't want the USA involved in the Second World War, were saying all kinds of things. The German-American Bund had rallies in Madison Square Garden, and there were widespread discussions of that. And there was a divide, and it's interesting. It was the factory owners, the industrialists. They didn't like the labor unions. The labor unions were led by Marxists and communists, and they cut into their profits.
Right.
And Roosevelt was friendly with the Rockefellers and with the British, that they kind of make their profits by selling oil to the world, by dominating international finance. So the factory owners, they were more sympathetic to the Nazis because the Nazis killed the communists and, got the economy going with all kinds of military spending. Whereas the oil monopolies and the bankers were more sympathetic to Roosevelt because they wanted to maintain their domination. And Germany was a rival that had been beaten down, a country that had been stripped of its colonies after World War I. And then Hitler came to power, and all of a sudden Germany was a power again, and it was seizing territory and claiming new colonies, et cetera. And so Germany was now a rival once again, and they didn't want to have a rival. And that underlying World War I and World War II was the tension between the economy on the European mainland and the American and British economy that is based on the ocean and global trade, right? The Atlanticist international order versus the economy on the European mainland. And the greatest fear of the British Empire and Wall Street has been the Germans and the Russians getting together. Because if they got together, then that would end British and American domination of the European mainland and possibly of the whole world. And they have done everything they could to keep those two countries, Germany and Russia, from ever getting along. I would argue even, destroying the Nord Stream pipeline. That has always been their fear. And that, the reason that Hitler ultimately came to power is the British were very, very afraid of a communist revolution in Germany. The German Communist Party was huge. It was the biggest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Union. And they had all kinds of neighborhoods and communities and networks of people. They seized a section of Berlin in 1929. It was like an armed civil war. And there was a real danger that if the crisis got worse in Germany, the communists would take over. So it's been revealed that the British gave lots of support to anti-communist fanatics, street fighters, people they called the Freikorps and others, that were killing communists and were fighting communists to make sure that Germany did not go over to the Russian camp. And then ultimately, one of those guys, the Nazis were just this anti-communist street fighting group, this group of radicals, that street fighters that had some kind of like rhetoric that mixed elements of the far left and the far right. And as they grew in popularity, Hollimer Schacht, the banker, realized that, it was either the far right or the far left, and he didn't want the communists to come in. So Hitler kind of toned down his message, and that's where he had the fight with Gregor and Otto Strasser and others. And Hitler was kind of groomed to be the leader who would kind of reestablish the power of German finance and German industrialists. And that's where Nazism really came from. It was German imperialism trying to reassert itself, in competition with British and American imperialism, but also holding off the threat of communist revolution.
Do you think the Trotskyites that became the neocons, what do you even want to label them? Just neocons? I mean, what is just neocons?
I mean, they called themselves the third camp Trotskyists for a while, and they were followers of this guy, Max Shachtman. So people called them the Shachtmanites. I'm from a small town in Ohio. It sounds like a group of Amish people with beards, right? The Shachtmanites or something. But it was, they were around, people called them the Yipsels. The organization that they controlled for many years was called the Young People's Socialist League, the YPSL. So people in New York City called them the Yipsels. And so there you go. There's different ways of calling them, but it's this group of people, the New York intellectuals, yes.
And they're the neocons who have infiltrated both the left and the right in our country.
Yeah, well, they figured out a message that is very appealing. Instead of opposing communism on the basis of it being godless, on the basis of it opposing free markets, they oppose it in leftist terms, spreading human rights, feminism, fighting for the liberation of LGBT people, etc. And they've taken kind of the leftist values that Marxists appealed to, and they've weaponized them to serve the Western system against the Marxists. And that's a pretty effective winning formula. People will rally to oppose governments on the basis of leftist causes far more than they'll rally to support them in the name of free markets or in the name of religion or whatnot. And that's right. When they started working for the CIA, that's what Sidney Hook told the CIA. I mean, if you read what I quote in my book about the cultural Cold War, Francis Stone Sonder, what they talk about is that there was this big communist conference in New York City in 1949, right at the height of McCarthyism. And all these people are protesting it. And they have a bunch of Catholic nuns. They're like blocking every door and praying and all of this. And Sidney Hook tells the CIA, he says, none of this is going to change any of their minds. The communists that are going in, this is going to reinforce their support. He says, but give me $100 million. $100 million and, the hiring power. Let me hire a group of people and I'll create a wave of democratic unrest that'll even get into Stalin's own armies. I can find the people. I can bring down the Soviet Union. He's saying, look, we can have a left flank. We can, quote, beat the communists at their own game. And that's a much more effective way of doing it. And that's what these neocons, these Trotskyites, these former Trotskyites, the Shachtman group, whatever you want to call them, that's what they were good at, is using what they learned on in the communist left and weaponizing it to serve the Western monopolies and imperialism.
Okay, so what do we do now? Like, what's the idea? So now we know, and now what?
Well, I think that we need to get back to the fact that populism is considered to be a bad word. And that's the weird thing. Populism is considered a bad word on the right. Populism is considered a bad word on the left. But overwhelmingly, no matter where you go in America, people will agree with three things. One, they'll agree that this country is run by a group of rich people and they wage wars around the world and they don't help us. And two, they'll agree that our freedoms are being taken away. The very freedoms that are supposed to be part of our American identity, free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, that's being taken away. Third, they will agree that our living standard is going down and our economy is getting worse and we need some dramatic moves to improve our economy. Those three things, those three populist beliefs that our freedoms are being taken away, that these wars are being waged for somebody else, and that our country's run by a group of rich people, that our living standard is going down and we need something to improve it. Those three things could be the basis of building a real movement to change this country. But that'll never come from the far left because they're concerned about identity politics. The Shockmanites that run DSA, the descendants of Irving Kristol and Irving Howe and Michael Harrington, they're never going to do that. And the right is certainly never going to do that, right? They believe in individualism and the free market and et cetera. And so it's going to have to come from the grassroots. But populism needs to be rediscovered at the end of the day, because populist movements are what have changed the world historically. The reason we have Social Security and unemployment insurance is that Communist Party these Trotskyites hated that entered a popular front with Roosevelt and built mass movements and waged the sit-down strikes of 1937 and occupied factories and the hunger marches where desperately poor people in New York City and in Chicago and Minneapolis and elsewhere poured into the streets to demand jobs or food for the hungry. Populist movements change the world, and the Trotskyites hate populism. The mainstream right hates populism, but populism is under the surface. Everyone knows it's coming. The awakening of average Americans is coming, and that's what our leaders are afraid of, and they're looking for any maneuver to throw it off. We need to get over the false polarization. Woke versus MAGA is not a real polarization. The real polarization is between the small elite that are taking our country toward a low-wage police state and marching us into World War III, and the overwhelming majority of Americans and humanity that doesn't want that. That's the real polarization. And woke versus MAGA, these psyops, these killings and political violence, it's a way to prevent the real polarization that's needed with some kind of false cultural polarization that we don't need.
Yeah. How would you redo the government if you were to remake it? You know, what would you say needs to be the biggest change? I mean, obviously the mentality, and it'd be great to clean house, but it doesn't mean that, I mean, if we cleaned house, for example, but kept everything as is, maybe, then they would just infiltrate again, right? So it's kind of like an infestation of termites. You know, you could fumigate the house, but they come back.
Well, right now, we need to defend our Constitution. We need to defend the fact that we have an elected government in this country. We have different branches of government. We have checks and balances. Sure, maybe down the road, as things change, we'll eventually start talking about writing some kind of more socialistic or something constitution. We're not there. That's very far in the future. Right now, the republic is under threat. It's under threat by the forces that would like to take away our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, our right to vote, our right to dissent in the name of waging their crusade against Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela, in the name of getting us to accept the worse and worse economy that we need to accept. And right now, I align myself with forces that want to defend our Constitution and defend our republic because it is in danger of getting eradicated, not by forces that want to create some kind of egalitarian socialist future, but by forces that want to create a low-wage police state, and that is the main danger.
Yeah. And I'm seeing that with the Trump administration. I mean, you know, there I was, somebody who actually supported the Trump administration this time around, thinking, well, it'll be better than the authoritarian Democrats, only to have it be, I mean, equal, if not worse, in authoritarianism right now with you can't burn a flag. What are you talking about? That's the most fundamental free speech, you know, symbol of free speech is the ability to burn the flag, right? I mean, you should be allowed to do that. Now you're not allowed to do that. Or just the, you know, we're going to curb certain speech that we don't like. You know, if you say this, then you're going to be, or the surveillance, allowing Palantir in to every single agency right now to gather all of our data and basically track us in each individual one by one. I mean, all of these scary things are absolutely happening to us. And we are losing our freedoms.
Yeah, you know, the Biden administration raided the homes of the Uhuru movement, raided the home of Scott Ritter. They wanted to throw you in jail or kick you out of the country if you wanted peace with Russia. Trump is kicking people out of the country because they disagree with Israel and they disagree with foreign policy about Israel and Palestine. Well, I think that as an American, I should be able to think whatever I want, and I should support or be able to support or oppose any country that I choose, right? And that should have no impact on whether I have a green card or whether I've got citizenship or whatever. I shouldn't be dragged into federal court or local court or any court because of my opinion about foreign policy or domestic policy. And that is in question right now. And the forces that want to overturn that are a great threat. And they certainly have a lot of influence in the Republican and Democratic parties. But Americans don't agree with it. Americans love our freedoms. And we know that's what is supposed to make this country unique. And again, populism. Populism is what is needed more than anything.
Yeah. I would like to agree with you that I think Americans want freedom, but I actually see, and I think if you ask any American, they'd say, yeah, of course, that's what makes America great, is that we're a free country and all these things. But it's the same group of people that then turn around and say, you should be banned. You're kicked out of the country if you say this. You should lose your citizenship. You shouldn't be allowed to say this. You shouldn't be allowed to do this. People are very quick to try to control others. I think it's, unfortunately, and this whole discussion just going back to, Stalin and Marxism and Trotskyism and Trotskyites and all these things, it's that it almost just feels like, you know what, authoritarianism is just the human condition. Like, we just love to boss everybody around and control everybody. And then if we can even gain power by forming groups and really being able to do it more, then we're going to do it as human beings. It seems like that is the human condition, unfortunately.
Well, and that's what they would argue, right? They view human beings as contemptible, and that's why we need to be controlled, and that's why we need the noble lie, and that's why we have to spread freedom to make sure we don't get together and form governments that would impose on them. I mean, that's the neocon view, actually, more than anything, and it becomes almost like a dog chasing its tail, right?
Yeah.
The reason we can't have RT, we're told, is that, Putin doesn't believe in freedom. And so if RT exists, well, then people might watch that, and then that will strengthen this guy who doesn't believe in freedom. So we got to take away the freedom of RT. It becomes nonsensical at some point. But this is the irony of liberalism. Liberalism, the Western ideology that views individualism above all else, has never been sincere. From the time of the founding fathers, we're talking about freedom while they had slaves, up until, more recently, liberalism is always propped up by illiberalism. Because when it gets down to it, human beings are collective creatures. We define ourselves in relationships with other people. We work in groups. We're not, tigers out alone hunting in the jungle all by ourselves. We are collective creatures, and that Western liberalism is a good thing. I think freedom of religion, freedom of speech, these are all good things. These are great advances that I'm very proud of as someone from a Western country, but we've taken it too far. We've taken this individualism to a rather extreme length where we're trying to break down any collective identity, whether it's class identity, whether it's national identity, whether it's gender or whatever. We're just trying to break us all down into atomized individuals. You can't have a society like that. You need people to have a collective sense of identity.
Caleb Maupin, thank you so much for being here. The book is Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, The Whole Story. This book's out now, or is this a pre-order?
It is out. It's been published.
It's been published. It is out. You are so knowledgeable about all of this stuff. This is especially history buffs that love to get a different perspective of history, or even, like you said, this is the only book that's been written on this. And this is definitely a discussion that's been out there in social media circles, and many topics that are being discussed right now, I think, are buried in this book for people to read. So there's a lot of gems in there. Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, The Whole Story. Caleb Maupin, thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, that was a very interesting conversation with Caleb. He's always so insightful, always just got a ton of knowledge. Sometimes people like Caleb, there's others like him, Whitney Webb and others that just, Scott Horton, they just blow my mind with how much information they can actually keep in their brain. And I'm so jealous of it. I wish that I could have that sort of knowledge stored in my brain at all times. But I got to be honest with you. Somebody asks me even 1 hour after doing the show, what did you talk about today? And my response is, I don't remember. It's just in one and out the other, but I kind of have to do that in order to stay sane. I do that in order to, I have to move on to the next show every day. I've got to do a different topic, a different thing. And so I'm always having to learn a lot and absorb a lot. And so for me, it's kind of like being, I'm good, or like, what's the phrase where it's like I know a little about a lot. That's kind of me. Whereas Caleb and others, they know a lot about a lot, actually. I'm not going to say they know a lot about a little, but I just love how knowledgeable Caleb is. All right, guys, we'll be back Tuesday with a great show. Monday is Labor Day, so we'll be barbecuing with family members and having a great time. Hopefully you'll be doing that. And we'll be back on Tuesday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. See you then. Have a great Labor Day weekend. Bye-bye.